to hear this appeal. Why would you say that really and truly this should be looked at by Justice Saunders and the rest of the panel at the CCJ?
Well, let me begin by saying that I have to be very careful with what I say, since this matter is in the courts at this particular time. And I don't want to fall in error of or to incur the anger of the learned justices who are hearing this matter. But the reason why we are there is because historically, in the Burnham years in Guyana, we had rigged elections, and the flag of the ruling party would fly on the apex court in our country, which was at that time the Court of Appeal, because he had pulled out of the Privy Council. Rights of people were violated, and the courts were used to exonerate that dictatorial, illegal regime. We in the PPPC signed on and adopted a Court of External Review, which is the CCJ, to hear our matters. And thank God we did, because if we did not, we would have been in a bigger mess like this. You would recall we had to go to the CCJ to deal with the matter of the unilateral appointment of the GCOM chairman. We had to go to the CCJ to deal with the validity of a no confidence motion that was passed against this regime since 21st of December 2018. And had it not been for us signing into law in Guyana, where the CCJ as a court of external review and our apex court in Guyana, we would have been in real political quagmire in Guyana, where the Court of Appeal would have ruled that 34 is the majority of 65. So the issue of jurisdiction is one where we have adopted by way of law that the CCJ is our apex court, and it's our highest court as a sovereign nation. The matter of Article 177.4, which the people on the other side are arguing has exclusivity and finality, is to a narrow issue. And I believe that my colleague, Priya Manickchand, who is also an attorney at law, might be best qualified to speak to those legal matters, since she is available here on this program as well. But it is our belief that at this particular time, the CCJ is adopting the right principle in hearing the matter. We await their decision. We don't expect miracles out of the CCJ. What we expect is for them to grant and operate in a very judicial manner that would allow these matters to return to the Guyana Elections Commission for a determination and a declaration. On the opening statement, you weren't sure how to position the PPPC, if they're in opposition or they're in government. Well, our constitution has clearly stated that the party whose lists have received the largest number of votes or more votes is deemed to be the president. So Dr. Mohammed Irfan Ali is currently Guyana's president-elect, just waiting for the formalities of a declaration from the Guyana Elections Commission. So we're at a stage of transition, and all that is happening in the courts is to prevent that transition. So Guyana is in a stage of transition. The PPPC has won these elections by way of the count on the night of the elections, and we have won these elections again by way of the numbers coming out of the recount, a 33-day process that was observed by CARICOM scrutineers. We have garnered 233,000 plus votes compared to the 217,000 that went to the incumbent. So we have won these elections by more than 15,416 votes. That's the reality. And all that we are having is delay tactics, real fancy footwork, so we would want to call it sand dancing, to prevent that transition of power. So we're at a stage where we are clear. Everybody in Guyana is clear. The Commonwealth, the OAS, the CARICOM, the United States, the Canadians, the European Union, the British, everybody is very clear that the PPPC have won these elections, and it's now about transitioning from one regime into the next regime, which is what the APNU AFC is reluctant to do. So I'll pause at this stage.
Thank you so much for that assessment, Bishop Edghill. And I want to actually go to Priya right now, because you're very correct that, Ms. Manickchand is an attorney at law. So grateful to have a legal mind with us as we try to navigate the twists and turns of what is going on at the CCJ right now. Now, what I was trying to figure out is that we have here an article actually that was published today by the Guyana Chronicle. And in this article, it is reporting that the lead counsel for the PPPC, Mr. Menz, is now agreeing that there is no jurisdiction by the CCJ to hear any appeal under this Article 177.4. So my question to you, Priya, if you don't mind, taking us through baby's first law class with us right now, what is being argued as we speak if the counsel for the PPPC is agreeing that there is no jurisdiction for CCJ under Article 177, Section 4?
So could I begin by saying that anyone who quotes the Chronicle, the Guyana Chronicle, has begun to mislead themselves from the beginning. The Guyana Chronicle is the state newspaper. It has been shameless in its promotion of partisan, not only policies, but partisan statements that have been proven in the courts to be wholly untrue. It is shameless in its promotion of rigging of elections. So throw that through the window even before we begin. Let me just say, but thank you for raising it, because it gives us an opportunity to talk about what Mr. Mendes is actually saying. Just to take you back a little bit, Janeka, I think the whole region knows this because, all my roommates and so on and classmates knew about it. Guyana is known for its sordid history, a sordid past of rigged elections. We had elections in this country that were rigged where the people's will were never given effect for in excess of 28 years. And in fact, it was one of those, particularly, that was one of the guiding reasons that we chose the Caribbean Court of Justice as our apex court, because in that period where elections were rigged, and by rigged, I don't mean rigged because Guyanese felt so, or partisan people who lost the election felt that it was rigged. I mean, the entire world saw this as rigged elections. Recently released documents in the US and the UK have told us just how rigged those elections were, because during that period, the courts were used shamelessly and to maintain a government in power that ought not to have been power and that did not enjoy the benefit and the confidence of the people of Guyana. Recently, I think only last week, Mr. Hammersmith, a name known by all in the Caribbean, Christopher Hammersmith, wrote that 40 years ago he had, he's based in Trinidad, but 40 years ago he'd attended a conference and he doesn't remember anything about it. It was a constitutional law conference, but what is vivid in his memory is a presentation made by one David de Carries from Guyana, where he had brought very vividly to the attention of the audience there how the courts in Guyana, their failure to stand up and sometimes their ability to twist the law and get creative had kept a dictatorial, murderous regime in place. And in his call, he said, we must not at all ever let Guyana get to this place again. So where are we now? What happened? On March 2nd, Guyana went on elections. At the end of that election, every single person, including the incumbent president, the head of the Guyana Elections Commission, which is the body that runs off elections. All of the political parties, we have 11 that contested the elections. All of the international observers, including the Carter Center, the Organization of American States, the Commonwealth Group of Countries, the United Nations, the Private Sector Commission, Bar Association, just American Chamber of Commerce, everybody who observed the election said, beautiful, smooth process. People were able to exercise their franchise. Nobody was disenfranchised. The process went according to plan, and that it was all well done. Within 2 days, elections results started coming in publicly, where everybody knew the position of the results. And we had known by then, everybody knew by then, that the People's Progressive Party, Civic, the party I belong to and Mr. Edghill belonged to, had won the elections. We are presently in opposition. Then a very strange thing happened. Region 4, District 4 was all of a sudden just given numbers by the official in charge, numbers that did not reflect the will of the people, but that would put the APNU-AFC, Mr. Granger's party, in the lead, so as to suggest that he won the elections. There was a big hue and cry, not only by Guyanese and not only by the People's Progressive Party, but by rights-loving, democratic people across the world who protested that. And then we saw various interventions since then. The most notable being that the Caribbean community sent down 5 heads of government, including Prime Minister Motley, who at the time was the chair of CARICOM, Mr. Rowley, Mr. Ralph Gonzalez, I think Mr. Gaston, a few of the...
Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Skerritt.
Yes, 5 of the heads of government across the region had come down, and they agreed, the parties agreed that we would have a recount of the ballots, which we did. The recount showed exactly what the election night count showed, and that is that the People's Progressive Party won the election. During that recount, we were told before the recount that the ANU would win the election because they had gotten more votes at the poll. But whilst the recount was going on, it became clear that that was not going to happen. So we started hearing some incredibly fantastic, and by that I mean in the realm of fantasy, claims being made, such as, and I'm quoting here, these are verbalized statements, people had gotten up from the dead, they rose out of their graves, they went to the place of poll, they voted, and they went back to rest. Or that persons who had migrated voted in these elections. Now, to both claims, all of the people they said who were dead have come forward to say, we didn't die, we were right here and we voted. And of the 500 persons they said were not in the country, most of those have turned up with affidavits, sworn affidavits, willing to put themselves, willing to perjure themselves, not only to say we voted, but many of them to say we don't have passports, we've never traveled, we don't have visas, we are right here, we voted. So that was debunked. There were various court proceedings and so on. And then the GCOM chair on the 16th of June made a decision that she had no authority, no mandate, no jurisdiction to determine what votes were valid and what votes were not valid, as a result of which she would have to treat all the votes that are in the box as valid, and the election results should be declared as is. Then we saw a new set of shenanigans. Janeka, look, we could dress this up as much as we want. What we have here is an attempt to rig the elections. The people of Guyana came out, they voted in one way. The political party headed by David Granger does not like the way the people voted, and he insists on staying in government. I'm not sure if you are familiar with John Beale. He is an ambassador. He used to be an ambassador from Barbados to the OAS and to the United States. And he said very clearly, in political circles in the Caribbean, people are referring to Mr. Granger as a sanctimonious gangster. my president is being called a gangster because he's trying to gangster these elections. And there's really no way to dress it up. And I wish I could speak pretty language and talk to you about diplomatic things here, but you're trying to thief an election. It's very difficult to make that diplomatic. We have had
Let,
yes.
let me just interrupt you here, because there's a number of things that I want to get some clarity on, but I want to just quickly go back to Bishop Edghill, because I am hearing everything that you are saying, and from outside of Guyana, it really looks confusing, because you have the chief election officer tabulating one set of results and saying that, well, we're not certifying as yet, but it looks like PPPC is coming back into office. And then, less than 2 weeks later, we have another tabulation of results, and the same individual is now saying, oh, well, by the way, between then and now, I found 115,000 votes that need to be discarded. So I putting aside everything that is happening in the court system right now, has Chief Election Officer Lewinfield ever addressed that issue specifically, in that, how did he arrive, or how did he transition from this tabulation to this tabulation? What is the status of those 115,000 votes, and what process did he use by which those votes were deemed invalid post the recount, the observed and audited recount? Have we heard anything from Mr. Lewinfield about that issue? And if not, when do you think that this issue, which again, to me, an outsider, a non-legal mind, seems to be the real crux of the matter? How did those 115,000 votes go from being included to being disallowed? Have we heard anything from that, from GCOM, from Mr. Lewinfield, from anybody at all?
The short answer to that is no, we have not heard anything. But let me say a little bit so that your audience could understand what is taking place. Mr. Lewinfield, as our Chief Elections Officer, after the passage of the no confidence vote, which should have had elections within 90 days, became the beneficiary from the government that had fallen 2 acres of prime residential land in a village called Mocha, and 100+ acres of land at a place in Region 10 called Millie's Hideout. A fallen government that had no authority to distribute land because of their caretaker status, Mr. Lewinfield became the gazetted beneficiary of 2 sets of lands. So that explains Mr. Lewinfield's relationship with the current government. Mr. Lewinfield did everything within his power to delay elections that should have been held within 90 days from the no confidence motion to 14 months. 14 months. Mr. Lewinfield is part of a rigging cabal that included the unilaterally appointed chairman that had to be removed by the judgment of the CCJ, retired Justice James Patterson. There is included in that cabal a deputy chief elections officer by the name of Roxanne Myers, who was hired even though she was not qualified or the most qualified candidate. There was somebody else who had greater experience, greater qualification, who was pushed aside to facilitate her into that post. So the machinery of GCOM was being compromised and set for rigging. The reality is the PNC-led APNU-AFC government do not intend to come out of office. They don't have democratic credentials. So Mr. Lewinfield got the District 4 returning officer, which my colleague Priya Manickchand was speaking about, to make 2 declarations, one on March 5th and one on March 13th. Both of those declarations to Region 4 had different numbers. And both times the numbers bear no resemblance to the official documents generated at each place of poll, which is called a statement of poll. That led to the recount. The recount had 10 certified documents, certificates that made 460,000 plus votes valid. Now in Guyana, the law says what makes a vote not valid. Number one, if it is not marked for any political party. There's some people who go to the polls and they don't mark the ballot. That vote is rejected. Number two, if it is marked for more than one party. Number three, every polling place to authenticate the ballot generates what is called a 6-digit stamp. If the ballot, even though it is marked, don't have the 6-digit stamp, it is rejected because it could have meant somebody wickedly or corruptly inserted that ballot into the box. Every ballot in the box must have the 6-digit.
But sorry to interrupt you, Bishop. But this process in terms of validating ballots and looking at them, scrutinizing the ballots, this process is done. Prior to even the initial tabulation of results. So the ballots
Yes,
are scrutinized. If I'm understanding correctly, in elections, basically around the globe, these things are scrutinized, and people are fighting over valid ballots, rejected ballots, spoiled ballots, all of that, even before you get to that preliminary tabulation and eventual certification.
You are correct. You are correct.
So what seems to me to be a little bit confusing is how so many ballots actually made it through. And, because there is an official report from the chief elections officer, I must, kind of take that at face value and interrogate the report as given. So how did so many invalid ballots make its way through the initial GCOM count, the CARICOM observed recount, and were then only discovered, after the Court of Appeal gave the interpretation of more votes cast, meaning more valid votes cast? When will that question come before a court, any court, whether it is the Court of Appeal, whether it is the CCJ? When are we going to get to that stage?
No. Let's be very clear about something. There is no court that has said ever that Mr. Lewinfield or anyone else has the ability to determine which votes are valid and which votes are not valid. I like the fact that you've just removed all the fluff. Let's interrogate something. On the night of elections, all the political parties had observers in there. We had foreign observers in. We had strangers in. We had people who were not partisan there, and they've all discarded right there valid votes and invalid votes. Like you said, on that night, valid votes were counted, invalid votes were put aside in an envelope. They were called rejected votes. Now, a number was given on election night, and that number showed the PPP winning. During the CARICOM observed recount, the exact same thing happened. The votes that were invalid were discarded, and the valid votes were counted. Mr. Lewinfield gave 2 reports. So you said you wanted to, and I think that's fair. Let's interrogate Mr. Lewinfield's reports. He is the chief election officer. He gave 2 reports. Last week, he gave a report that said 285,000 votes would be invalidated. He did not tell us why. He did not tell us how. He did not tell us how he reached that number. He decided by himself, with himself, that 285,000 votes from the people of this country would be invalidated. Then there was a Court of Appeal application to determine what does most votes cast mean. And the Court of Appeal said, when you say most votes cast, we're talking about most valid votes. Nobody in this country, nobody in the world, and certainly not the People's Progressive Party Civic, ever had any doubts about what votes we were counting. It was always valid votes. you can't count invalid votes. After that decision, Mr. Lewinfield came back and offered a second report. His second report seeks to invalidate not 285,000 like the week before, but now 115,000 votes. Again, he fails to tell us how he reached this number. Why is it 115,000 votes are invalidated? Who told him to invalidate them? Why were they thrown out? And then when he invalidates those votes, the remaining balance, he apportions those by himself. This is one man. He apportions those so much to one party, so much to another party, giving the incumbent, the APNU-AFC, a win in the National Assembly that the people of Guyana did not give them. So to answer your question, how is it that Mr. Lewinfield determined that these votes were invalid? We don't know that. I suspect strongly Mr. Lewinfield doesn't know that. We believe and we are alleging strongly, and I hope he sues me so that we could interrogate this in a court, that it is corrupt behavior that he's engaging in here, that it is electoral fraud that he is engaging in here. And there's no other, I mean, look, even if you brought someone who's close to Mr. Lewinfield or close to the APNU-AFC, they're going to be incapable and unable to tell you how it is he arrived at these particular numbers. Even Mr. Lewinfield's numbers have changed, and we don't know why. Last week he said it was 285,000 votes that were invalidated. This week he says, because that was really vulgar, that gave them a 2/3 majority in the National Assembly. This week he says it's not 285, it's 115. We are saying that there is at no point the Court of Appeal did not give Mr. Lewinfield any ability to determine by himself what valid votes are and what valid votes are not. And I am saying to you that in the present proceedings happening right now in the CCJ, that court is not going to be able to give to Mr. Lewinfield the ability by himself as the chief election officer or anybody else who sits in that seat, the ability by themselves to determine what are valid votes and invalid votes. And let's just take this practically. You are saying, one political party is saying, the APNU-AFC, Mr. Granger's party is saying, Mary Jane and John Doe were not in the country on election day. Their vote must not be counted. We don't know which is their vote in the ballot box. So what Mr. Lewinfield has done is he's discarded all those votes. We do not hear from Miss Mary Jane. We have not asked John Doe where he was. I mean, these people have come forward naturally and of their own volition to say where they are. But courts don't work that way. Public officers have to hear. You have to give a hearing to the person you intend to disadvantage. You know that. And so no court is going to give Mr. Lewinfield the ability, including the CCJ right now, when this matter is finished, the ability to determine what votes are valid and what votes are not valid, which means that he is really on a frolic of his own. His behavior has been condemned by every single international body. In fact, the Organization of American States has gone as far as to say that the incumbent government must start the process of transition to the new government, to the Irfan Ali political party, because they've lost the election. Mr. Nelson Mandela, as you know, has a group of elders. They have called, I think as recently as yesterday, they made a few statements before, but as recently as yesterday, they said very clearly that the recount results, less those invalidated by Mr. Lewinfield, must be used to declare a winner. The Caribbean community, through its CARICOM chair, as well as through various individual members, have called for the numbers in the recount to be used and for the presidential candidate that won the elections to be sworn in. The ABC countries in Guyana, we call America, Britain, Canada, and the European Union have said very clearly that the recount results must be used without the deductions by Mr. Lewinfield. 2 days ago, the Kingdom of Norway said very clearly that the recount results must be used by Mr. Lewinfield. Last night, Mr. Granger says that he is going to be, and based on Mr. Lewinfield's results, he is going to be sworn in as the next president. Listen, we could try to interrogate this and fix it and work it out as much as we want. This is really a common, vulgar attempt to thief an election, and it don't really matter how you try to fix it and turn it and try to figure it out. This is what it is, and that is why it's difficult to get to the bottom of the whys and the wheretofores.
People are already advancing the idea that no matter what the courts adjudicate in this and the other challenges that are inevitable over the whole, that there will be, approximately, I don't want to say half, but no matter what the decision goes, there will be a significant number of people who would not accept the results and who will insist that there was some kind of fraudulent activity. You know, if the courts rule in favor of the PPPC, if the courts rule in favor of the APNU-AFC, there are going to be some people who are going to walk away with the conviction and the firmly held belief, the sincerely held belief that something went wrong somewhere. And the suggestion is coming out that maybe Guyana should just redo the election. Is this something that the PPPC is considering? How do you feel about having to go back? I know that President Granger has already intimated that the country cannot afford to do a general election, but maybe if you look under the couch cushion somewhere, you'll find enough money to run another poll. Would the PPPC accept that?
Well, if I'm to go first on this one, I was making the point. No matter how you twist it or you turn it, the chief elections officer and rogue elements within GCOM are compromised, and they will, no matter what it takes, fraudulent, corrupt means, produce results that shows that the Granger administration would have won.
And just to interrupt you there, the report from the recount committee assigned by CARICOM actually did point to some serious flaws in the composition of GCOM, in the mandate of GCOM, in the way that GCOM conducts its activities, and did make some strong recommendations that some serious reform be done. And I just wanted to let the viewership know that you're not just saying that. This is in the report that was submitted by that recount observer mission. So I just wanted to just pause to let that be noted.
Well, let's take this to the logical conclusion. You have an election, a contesting political party refuses to accept defeat. They have people who are compromising the electoral system, who have given them a victory on no basis of fact or law. Just fictitious numbers. Mr. Mingo did it twice. Mr. Lewinfield did it twice. You go back to a next election, we're talking about the annulment and going back to a next election. What would be different? Nothing will be different. Now, what is required at this stage, and this is the PPPC's position, we must take this March 2nd, 2020 election to its logical conclusion. That is a declaration and the swearing in of the new president. The matters that are referred to in the CARICOM report and other observation missions report might be the subject of constitutional reform to reform the Guyana Elections Commission. But you went into the game with these rules. You played with these rules, and these rules must determine the outcome at this particular time. Peter Wickham, who worked for the APNU-AFC in some years back, he made a statement that is known throughout the Caribbean. Elections are simple. The party with the most votes win. What is so difficult about conceding defeat and allowing the country's democracy to be preserved, and we deal with the other matters after? the next thing I want to mention is that our Constitution provides a remedy for parties that are aggrieved with the results of an election. I think it's Article 163, and it says you can challenge the outcome if you are aggrieved, you're not satisfied, by way of an elections petition to an elections court. We did that in 2015, and the very same Mr. Lewinfield, who's the chief elections officer, who should have been a neutral party to facilitate the court's process to determine the outcome of that election, have done everything within his power to obstruct the court from proceeding with the investigation into the elections petition. So you could understand the role that Mr. Lewinfield is playing in all of this.
Well, the problem is...
Let me just finish this.
Okay,
Let me just finish this. The narrative of the PNC-led APNU AFC has been, number one, they won the elections. When they realized the numbers were not going to change, they said we must annul the elections. In that process to annulling the elections, they said there must be shared governance. And in the shared governance model, Mr. Granger must remain president and Mr. Irfan Ali must subjugate himself, even though he won the elections, to that. Then we have now come to this other mantra. We have won the elections based upon valid votes, and the valid votes that they're talking about is Lewinfield sitting with corrupt political types who would like to get an electoral victory, configuring some numbers to show that the APNU AFC has won an election when the numbers in the ballot box reveal something differently. So let me just say, the PPPC in its manifesto has committed to constitutional reform through a consultative process with the people. If the recommendations of CARICOM, the Carter Center, the Commonwealth requires a reformulation of GCOM, through that consultation, constitutional reform will come. But we went into the game with these rules. We must bring this election to its logical conclusion, which is a declaration. And finally, the court will not announce who won or who lost the election. The only competent body to do that is the Guyana Elections Commission. The court, no matter that is at the CCJ, will deal with the fact, number one, if the Court of Appeal in Guyana had jurisdiction to practically amend our constitution by the insertion of a word. Secondly, Mr. Lewinfield did not receive any orders or direction from the court to submit a report with deducted votes. The chairman of the Guyana Elections Commission instructed him to prepare a report based upon the 10 certificates coming out from the recount. He refused to do that, but he submitted a report with 115,000, votes invalidated, saying that he got instructions to do that from the Court of Appeal, which is a total fabrication, a misrepresentation, and a blatant lie. So the narrative of the PNC to confuse the population and to get support wherever they could find it is one that must be debunked. It is evil. It is wicked. They have never won the elections. They have lost, and they're just throwing in red herrings to create confusion. And no amount of dressing it up will change it. That's the reality of the situation. So I thought I would say that.
So, Janeka, you asked a specific question. And
before you jump in, Priya, I just want to add this other thing to your plate, and then I'll give you some time to address the different areas raised. Because Bishop Edghill made a very valid point in that nothing can move forward unless it seems to me that there is a declaration made. So the election has to be decided, and a certification has to be made by GCOM. And then after that happens, you can have electoral petitions, you can have a lot of interrogation as to what votes were valid and what was not. But there is a restraint placed upon GCOM right now, right, preventing them from actually making a declaration in the election until all of these court matters have been decided upon and figured out. So when Do you think, Priya, we will be able to get to the stage when GCOM can actually say, this is the winner of the election, and then have the post-declaration process begin to play out? Because we have not gotten there yet.
Right. And so you asked, I'll come to the second question,
sure.
But you asked earlier if the PPPC would be willing to annul these elections and go back to another election. The answer is absolutely not. We won these elections. The elections are about giving the people of a country the ability to determine who they want in government. And so you alluded to the fact that whoever won here, some people won't be happy. Well, that's elections in every single country. St. Lucia, Antigua, the United States of America, and Guyana. There are always going to be people who are not happy because they had a political party they wanted to get into office, and that political party did not get into office. The responsible thing for leaders, particularly the losing leaders, to do is to say to their followers, to say to their supporters, we lost these elections, we will represent you anyway in the National Assembly, and we are going to come back stronger and take this government again in 2025. That's what we did in 2015. We did not burn the streets of Georgetown. We did not fight on the streets. We did not beat people up. We did not spend 200 days waiting for delaying the results of the election. We did not corrupt public officers to declare us the winners when we were not. So we will certainly not, we do not have the mandate to throw away the will of the people and determine by ourselves, for ourselves, that we will have another election. We simply cannot do that, annul these elections and have another election. Secondly, we expect, and we have not seen that, so the responsible behavior from the other side, we've seen one or two persons. Look, even in the APNU AFC, they had leaders who came out and said, these results are corrupted. We need to give up. We need to get into the opposition and start our work there. This is at the foot of David Granger, the president. He wants to be president despite the fact that the people do not want him to be president. And that really is the problem. Should we have constitutional change? Should we implement the results, the recommendations that the CARICOM team has made? Of course. Look, in any election, anywhere in the world that you open boxes or that you audit, you'll find that there are things that can be done better. When you have such a large number of persons manning a system, you'll have mistakes, human error. Some will be negligent. Some would not have been up for the job in the first place, but they were hired. That will happen. But the effect of the elections, the purpose of an election is to give the will of the people effect. So no, the PPPC is absolutely not going to allow for these elections to be annulled. These elections must be declared based on the way the people voted. And your second question is, when will it happen?
Okay, so Priya, I think we have lost some of your audio. I am not sure what's going on, but we're going to try to get back your audio. Let me see if I have audio from Mr. Edghill. Bishop, can you just say something to see if I can?
Yes, I'm hearing you loud and clear.
So we have audio. Okay, Priya, you're back. Could you just finish your thought, please?
Yeah. So your question is, when is this going to end? The court is not going to say. There is a court that can investigate whether votes are valid or whether votes are not valid. There is a court that can do that, and that is the High Court through an elections petition. I think in every single election Guyana has had, there have been elections petitions filed, but that is after a declaration is made and the relevant documents filed, and then the court investigates whether or not votes are valid. No court ever gave Mr. Lewinfield the ability to determine what votes are valid. Indeed, no court can give Mr. Lewinfield ability to determine what is valid. So the CCJ's hearing today is not going to be able to say to Mr. Lewinfield or anybody else who sits in that office, it's a statutory office, you could sit by yourself and decide that 115,000 votes or 215,000 votes are not valid. No court is going to say that. The court, you asked me what I expected at the end of today's hearing. At the end of today's hearing, the court is not going to say which party won the election or which party lost the election. The court is probably more likely to determine what the Court of Appeal has jurisdiction to do in a very narrow sense. And the court may express some views on good governance during elections processes, but that may be as wide as they go. So after today, what we expect and what we will insist, I'm not sure if you're aware that earlier today, the Secretary of State of the United States, Mr. Mike Pompeo, insisted that the recount and the entire process had gone on for way too long, and that he had instructed his officers to hold accountable persons who were deliberately or unconsciously delaying the announcement of these results. And that was a statement.
Yeah, I did actually watch the video. I received it just before we went on air, and I will tell you that there are many people in the Caribbean region who feel extremely uncomfortable with the intervention of the U.S. State Department into regional electoral matters. As you can understand, the region has had a slightly difficult history with American adventurism on our shores. But because we're quickly running out of our time, but I cannot, it would be very remiss of me if we did not address the elephant in the room, especially from the perspective of your regional neighbors who are looking in. We all know that Guyana has recently been the site of major offshore oil deposit discoveries. So really and truly, the future of the country is what is being tussled over right now, because the government that forms or the party that forms the next government of Guyana is most likely going to have the privilege of presiding over a very prosperous time in the country's history. So in that context, for us outside, for us looking in, we feel the urgency of this general election. We feel the frustration of Guyanese citizens who, 120 days onward, cannot move on with the next phase of governance in the country. And I think this is what is bringing really all of this scrutiny, because we understand that the stakes are high, and we are very concerned that somebody could be gaining power in an unethical way. Now, to speak about that in the context of your party, there have been accusations, and I realize that Guyana is a very, very highly partisan society. Even the press is aligned with one party or another. But there have been accusations that your prime ministerial candidate, Bharat Jagdeo, has enjoyed very close relationships with several CARICOM leaders, Prime Minister Motley, Prime Minister Gonzalve, all of the five who had actually come down in the initial mission. And also there have been suggestions that the justice of the CCJ, Chief Justice Adrian Saunders, actually enjoys a very close relationship with the St. Vincent Prime Minister, Ralph Gonzalve, who coincidentally assumes the chairmanship of CARICOM right now. Is Guyana so here's my question, is Guyana at such a tipping point that we are willing to denigrate and call into question the integrity of regional multilateral bodies such as CARICOM, such as the CCJ, for one party or another to gain an electoral and political advantage? Is this the state of things in Guyana right now? And how do you recover from that?
So, Janeka, two things. One, all of those questions about whether we have wealth, whether we are going to be entering into a wealthy period in our country, and who would be best to look after that country and that wealth, those were all interrogated, investigated, and dealt with by the people of this country in the run-up to an election. And the people of this country made a choice. That choice has to be respected. And the choice they made is that the People's Progressive Party Civic is best to lead in the period of wealth that you described. But I want to bring to your attention the fact that when 1980, 1985, 1978, those are all years that we did not have oil, but we had rigging in the country. Because the PNC, the party who is now presently trying to rig the elections, that is in their DNA. That is what they know. Secondly, I would be disappointed. First of all, President Jagdeo was president of this country. He is not the prime ministerial candidate, although many in the country would like to see him.
Oh, I do apologize for that error.
That's fine. It's perfectly understandable. I would be surprised if he did not have cordial relations with other Caribbean leaders. I would be surprised if President Granger doesn't have cordial relations with Caribbean leaders. In fact, Mr. Granger boasts of his very good relations with the CARICOM leaders. To say, and this is for me slightly offensive, so I want to be very clear, to say that Mia Motley and Rowley and Gonzalez and Mr. Gaston and the Grenadian Prime Minister and the Jamaican Prime Minister and all these people have come together to stop election rigging in Guyana because they love Mr. Jagdeo is really, really to minimize the issue we have here. The problem really is if you have one rogue country in the CARICOM, one rogue country who decides it's going to thief an election, and with that comes, I mean, you know, we talk about stealing an election and it's bad enough as it is, but it will come with erosion of rights like never seen, that we have seen here in Guyana, where you can't speak freely, where to speak freely you get blown to bits, and these are not exaggerations, this happened in our country, where people's houses are searched because they have opinions, where people have to send their children out to this country just so that they could live. That is what comes with dictatorships. And when you have one infected country in a small region like CARICOM, then CARICOM loses its efficacy in terms of what it can do as a group in the world with other countries. And to suggest that all these people just like Mr. Jagdeo, so they're going to let him rig an election or let him win an election that he did not get, it's stretching the imagination. I would like to say that these are our friends, particularly for this reason, to make sure we're on the straight and narrow is not only humane to the people of Guyana, The political parties are one thing. Bear in mind, we're talking about human beings, people who have children, people who want their children to get equal opportunities for education, people who want their children to be able to compete with the child in Barbados and the child in Trinidad. These are human beings we're talking about. And if we were to be abandoned by the CARICOM region, then that would be an inhumane act, almost a criminal act. So I am not sure. I mean, I'd expect Mr. Jagdeo to have friends, but hell, if I were to call on Mia Motley, and if I were to call on Mr. Rowley, and I've never met any of them personally, I expect that they would answer me because they are my Caribbean leaders and they have a duty to help me look after this country that we call a region. So that, I would be ashamed if I were Mr. Granger to say that he spent 5 years in office and couldn't get his friends to look after him. That's not what happened here.
Well,
What he could have is his friends to help him rig an election, because these are people who I suspect will just send packing anybody who tries to do that.
And look, I must point out that it was actually on the agreement of both parties and the invitation of President Granger himself that CARICOM actually got involved in the observation mission for the general election poll as well as the recount. So, I was quite surprised to hear these assertions. I thought that it would be, it would be appropriate to just present them to you for response. Unfortunately, we have completely exhausted the time that we spent today. I could have gone on, because there are so many different aspects of this situation to consider. I do know that both of you are kind of talking to me with one ear and listening in on the CCJ proceedings with the other. So at this point in time, let me let you guys go. Thank you so very much to my two guests, Bishop Juan Edghill, former junior finance minister, and Priya. And let me just make sure that I'm getting this correctly. Could you say it for me, Priya, please?
It's Priya Manickchand.
Manickchand, right. Thank you very much, attorney at law and also former education minister. Both opposition members of parliament awaiting their ascension back into government should things go their way in the court system. All of us in St. Lucia, as well as around the region, are looking at the proceedings in Guyana with some measure of concern, some measure of trepidation. This is a country that does have a history of election-related violence. Thus far, things seem to be relatively calm, and we hope that that continues as they sort their way through this political crisis. That's all the time that we have today. Join us again at 8 p.m. for tonight's primetime broadcast, and you can find me here at the same time tomorrow for another episode of the Choice News Now live midday program. Until then, Janeka Simon signing out.
So, if you look under a pan, you would see the flames going up towards the pan, sending off heat. That